So starting our work on factoring polynomials, in this video we will talk about how do we factor polynomials that have 4 terms, and we're going to introduce you to a method called factoring by grouping. So one of the things that you want to train yourself to do when you're asked to factor a polynomial is that you will always check first for a greatest common factor. Now, if you need some help in working with greatest common factors, I'll refer you back to the last couple of videos in the series. The first thing you will do is you will look at your polynomial. You will factor out any greatest common factor of all terms first. After that, we're going to take the polynomial and we're going to break it into two groups of 2 terms apiece. And from each of those groups, we will factor out greatest common factors. So let's go ahead and try that with our first example here. And we have here 5x cubed plus 15x squared plus 2x plus 6. We will take a look at those 4 terms and we will look for a GCF. And in this case, all 4 terms only have a 1 in common. So the GCF of all 4 terms is 1. But sometimes it's a good idea to just make a little note on the side of your work that you've already checked for that greatest common factor. The second step in our grouping method is that we are going to take the 4 terms and we're going to group them into 2 groups of 2 terms apiece. Now, we can leave the terms in the order that they're in, or there will be some times when we have to rearrange the order of the terms in order for the grouping method to work. So we're going to keep these in the order that they're in. And so I'm going to write a parenthesis to group together the first 2 terms, then leave a plus in between, and we will group together the second 2 terms. So notice that we really haven't changed the problem at all. We've just put together 2 groups of 2 terms apiece. Now we're going to look at each group separately, and from each group, factor out the greatest common factor. And you will know when you need to rearrange the order of your groups if you cannot find a greatest common factor. For example, here in 5x cubed plus 15x squared, we know that the greatest common factor is 5x squared. So we will factor out the 5x squared from the first 2 terms here in this first group, and that is going to leave us with x plus 3. Now we go to the second group of which is 2x plus 6, this binomial. The greatest common factor here is a 2. So I'm going to write plus 2. The plus came from this addition symbol that was there already, and then the 2 is the greatest common factor. And then I'm going to factor that, and that leaves me an x plus 3. So step number 2 was to group, and step number 3 was to factor GCFs from each group. Okay? Now I want you to notice that we have here, separated by a plus, these 2 groups, okay, and that they have something in common, and that's the binomial. So we did some previous work in a previous video factoring out greatest common factors where the binomial was in common, just like this. So you may recall that what we'll do next is that we're going to factor out the x plus 3. That's our common thing in these 2 groups, right? That's our greatest common factor. Open a parenthesis, and now from our first group, what's left behind is the 5x squared because we factored out the x plus 3. And from our second group, what's left behind is the plus 2. This is our final answer, and it's a good idea to check. So remember that we will check by using our FOIL method, right? And so we would get, here is the check. So I want you to see that this really works. Now notice that in the check, as I am doing my first, outer, inside, and last, that my middle terms here are in a different order than the original problem. But that's not a problem, is it? Because with addition, we know that we can add numbers in any order. That's called a commutative property. So this really does check, and our answer is as follows. So problem number 2, once again, we're going to factor. There are 4 terms. We're going to first look at all 4 terms and look for a GCF. And a GCF for all 4 terms? Nope, we don't have one. Okay, but you always want to check because you will notice as the problems go by that there will be some problems where you will have that extra added step of taking out a GCF first. Now, the second step is to group 2 and 2, leaving a plus in between. So I'm going to go ahead and leave these in the order they're in. So I will group the 8xy minus 6x in one group, plus I will group my 12y minus 9 in the second group. Now we're going to look at each group separately and we're going to factor out GCFs. So now it's GCF time again with each group. And in the first group, what they have in common, those two terms, is 2x. So we're going to factor out a 2x, which will leave us with a 4y minus 3. Now we're going to look at the second group, 12y minus 9. We're going to do the same thing. Look for a GCF. This time the GCF is 3. So we're going to factor out a 3. And it leaves behind 4y minus 3. Now here, this is where you know that you grouped your groups right, because you should at this step be left with that binomial. They should be the same. So if these are not the same, then you need to go back and check your work or change the order of the terms so that you can group in a different way and start the process again. Okay? So now our next step, once we've checked that those two binomials are the same, which they are, is to factor out that binomial. So we're going to factor it out. We're going to bring that binomial out as a GCF and open a parentheses, and then we're going to look at the two terms, and what's left behind is the 2x and the 3. I always take a look at both binomials just by sight and make sure that there's not another GCF that we missed somewhere along the line, and these look good. And again, you know that you can check that by doing our FOIL method. There's our answer. Now in problem number 3, once again, we're going to take a look at all 4 terms, and we're going to check for a GCF. And all 4 terms right now, the GCF is 1, the greatest common factor. We're ready to go to step 2. And in step 2, we're going to form our groups. One thing that I want you to notice, though, is that there is a subtraction sign right here before the third group. So we're going to have to take care of that. But let's go ahead and make our 2 groups. So we put parentheses. We have 20x cubed minus 4x squared. And then we have a plus here. And now you have a negative 25x plus 5. So notice how I tucked in that negative symbol with the 25, because it's important that at this step we have a plus right here when you're forming your groups. Okay, step number 3 is time to look at both groups and factor out a GCF again from each group. So from our first group, we have a 4x squared as a GCF. So we factor that out, and that leaves behind 5x. Now notice how we took out the entire 4x squared term. That's our second term, but that leaves behind a negative 1, doesn't it? Because remember, you can always check this by sight just by going, if I multiply 4x squared times a negative 1, do I get my negative 4x squared back? I do. So it's important that that negative 1 be there. Sometimes students miss that. Over here in the second group, our first term is negative, and we don't want our first term to be negative. Remember that our goal is that we need to get these 2 terms to factor in such a way that we have this 5x minus 1 here. We need that to be common to both, right? So what we're going to do is, we practiced this in our last video, is that we're going to factor out a negative GCF. Okay, so 25x and 5 have a 5 in common, but rather than just factoring out a positive 5, we're going to go ahead and factor out a negative 5. Negative 5, and then that will leave us here a positive 5x, and then negative 5 divided into a positive 5 is negative 1. So notice that was a little bit of an added step this time around, that we factored out a negative GCF so that now our 2 binomials, they do match, and that allows us to go to the next step where we factor out that binomial. So binomial comes out, 5x minus 1, and then what's left in the second binomial is 4x squared minus 5. This is a good one for us to check, right? Because we had these negatives. We have a lot of negatives here, so let's make sure everything's working out. Notice when we check, we get 20x cubed minus 25x minus 4x squared plus 5, which checks with our original problem, except that these two terms are in a different order, but that's okay. That part's okay. You just want to match and make sure that all the coefficients ended up with the right sign, which they did. So this checks, and that means that this is our final answer. Okay, taking a look at number 4, we're going to look first for a GCF of all 4 terms, and the GCF is 1. Now we're going to decide on our groups. I'm going to tell you that I'm looking at my first 2 terms and noticing that they don't have anything in common. Did you notice that? That's a clue for me. That tells me I probably need to do some rearranging here of terms. I'm going to rearrange the middle terms because I can see that then my first group will have y in common as a GCF. So that's going to be my strategy. So let's rewrite the problem. So we'll have x, y, but instead of that negative 54, now we have a plus 9y. And then since I'm thinking ahead, I'm going to put a plus here and bring the negative with the 54, and then on my negative 6x. Now it's time for me to group. So I will group the first 2. I will group the second 2 with parentheses and then always leave that plus in between, which is our goal. And in our first group now, our y is our GCF. So we're going to factor out GCF, which will leave us with an x plus 9. And in our second group, actually, I'm also seeing that my x term is over here on the right, on the far right. Did you see that? And what's my goal? My goal is to factor out a GCF from these 2 terms so that I end up with this x plus 9, isn't it? So I'm going to rewrite these. Let me rewrite them right up here. So notice I'm just changing the order. You see that? And now I'm going to look at those 2 terms, and I am going to factor out a GCF of negative 6. So remember we did that last time where we took a look at this first term being negative, and so we factored out a negative GCF, right? And so here we are going to be left with x, and then negative 6 divided into a negative 54 is a plus 9. And so that's good because that was our goal, wasn't it? That we needed to get another x plus 9 here. You see, that's to match those 2. Okay, so now we're ready for the next step, which is that we factor out the x plus 9, and then behind is left the y here and the negative 6 here. And again, this is something that we can FOIL to check. But did you notice what we did there? So we rearranged the terms so that we could get to this third line here where we have those 2 binomials x plus 9 that are the same. That's the best way to get this grouping method to work. I take a look at my last two binomials. I always check to make sure I didn't miss a GCF there, and I didn't. Problem number 5. We once again take a look at all 4 terms, looking for a greatest common factor, and oh my goodness, I think there's one. Don't you? Do you see it? This time we have a greatest common factor of 3. So our first step is going to be to take that out. We're going to factor out that 3 from all 4 terms. I'm going to write a 3 here, and then I'm going to have a big set of parentheses this time. And now I'm left with AB minus 4A minus 8B plus 32. So our first step, and we have to train ourselves all chapter. Anytime somebody asks you to factor a polynomial completely, always look for that greatest common factor as your first step before you start any of the methods, okay? So now we're going to take a look at our new polynomial that's in the parentheses, and we're going to form our group. So it's time to form the groups. Don't lose track of this outer 3. That outer 3 has to be part of your final answer, so find a way to not lose track of that, okay? All right, so that outer 3 is out there. I need to group my inside. So I have the 3 from before. All right, leave that there. And then I have AB minus 4A. I'm going to put a plus here because I'm going to tuck in the negative with the 8, just like that. And then using a different color, I'm going to group these first 2 terms and those second 2 terms. By the way, not a bad idea to use different color pens when you're working on factoring. From our first group, now that 3 is hanging on. From my first group, I have an A as greatest common factor. Leaves behind a B minus 4. And from that second group, I have to factor out a negative 8. And that leaves behind a b minus 4. Right? Right? Because negative 8 divides into positive 32 negative 4 times. So my signs are right. This is a good thing because now I have matching binomials, b minus 4. That binomial is going to go out as the greatest common factor and join the 3. Okay? So it's joining the 3. Well, you have the 3 from before. The b minus 4 as greatest common factor now. And in the new parentheses, we have left over this a minus 8. Now, sometimes my students ask me, how do I check that? And so when you have 3 expressions like these that you're trying to multiply together for checking, I recommend that you leave the 3 for last, okay? Go ahead and do your foiling first. Foil these first. Okay, so here's our check. 3 still there. So we're kind of going backwards the way we got here. So we'll foil these first. So that gives me AB minus 8B minus 4A plus 32. Okay, I'm doing my first outer, inside, and last. And then go ahead and distribute the 3. And so then I get 3AB minus 24B minus 12A plus 96, which it matches my original problem except for that those 2 middle terms being a different order. But you know that the main thing is that you're checking that the signs in the coefficients are matching, and they do. So this is our final answer. We did a good job there. But once again, the key was to recognize that there was a greatest common factor of 3 to start. Otherwise, you will get an answer, but it will not be factored completely. And so your instructor might not give you full points if this is like in a test or quiz or something, okay? So you got to factor completely. That's our goal. Here we are with problem number 6. And once again, we're going to look at all of these terms and look for a GCF. And I'm noticing that they're all even. So there's a 2 involved and they all have a W. Okay, so I'm not liking that my negative 4W cubed, which is my leading term, right? Just a review for you that the leading term in a polynomial is the term that has the highest power, okay? The highest exponent degree. And so I'm noticing that that's negative 4, and I want to take care of that right now. So we are going to take out a greatest common factor of negative 2W first. So negative 2W and big parentheses here. And now left behind is a 2W squared minus 8W plus 3W minus 12. Okay, now we're going to form 2 groups, and this order seems fine, so let's leave them in this order. Let's see what happens. Group the first 2, leave a plus, and group the second 2. And in the first group, we have a 2W in common, which leaves a W minus 4. And in the second group, we have a greatest common factor of 3. And that leaves behind a W minus 4. So we're on the right track because we've got matching binomials, right? Here and here, that's good, which we're going to factor out and bring it with the negative 2W that was there from before. So negative 2W, our original GCF, W minus 4, our new GCF, and left in the last parentheses is our 2W plus 3.